6 girls, chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, taken from their families and handed more legal power than almost any woman in Rome would ever hold. That is not a paradox that sits comfortably, and it is not meant to. The Vestal Virgins are one of the most revealing institutions in the ancient world, precisely because of what they hold together in one place: extraordinary sacred authority and extraordinary violent constraint, living inside the same body for 30 years. The fire they tended was not a symbol. The Romans understood it as the life force of Rome itself, the city's survival, its military campaigns, its harvests, its future, all understood to depend on that flame staying lit. The hearth goddess Vesta was among the oldest in the Roman pantheon, and her priestesses were among the oldest of Rome's sacred institutions. The historian Mary Beard, whose work on Roman religion and public life remains essential, has traced the Vestal cult back to the earliest period of the Roman state. The fire was not a ceremony that happened occasionally. It burned continuously. 6 women kept it burning day and night for over 1,000 years. The 30-year term was structured in 3 cohorts of 10 years each. A girl chosen between 6 and 10 spent the first decade learning the rituals, the prayers, the preparation of the mola salsa. The mola salsa was a sacred salted flour that the Vestals made themselves 3 times a year, and it was used in every major Roman religious sacrifice. No other priesthood prepared what Rome used to speak to its gods. The second decade was active service at the heart of Roman religious life. The third was teaching the next generation of initiates. At 36, or thereabouts, the term ended, and the Vestal was formally released. The authority they held during those 30 years was specific, documented, and remarkable. Roman women of this period existed almost universally under male guardianship. A father, a husband, a male relative held legal authority over their lives, their property, their decisions. The Vestals were exempt. They held full legal independence, managing their own affairs without a guardian, at a time when that was essentially unheard of for any Roman woman. Their testimony in court required no oath. In a legal system built entirely on the formal weight of oaths, that exemption was not minor. It meant their word was already understood to carry sacred authority beyond what an oath could add. When they moved through the streets of Rome, a Vestal was preceded by a lictor, a magistrate's attendant who carried the fasces, a bundle of rods symbolizing the power to punish, and who cleared the path ahead. Lictors preceded consuls, praetors, and emperors. They were the walking embodiment of Roman state power. A Vestal walked with one. If a condemned man being led to execution crossed her path by chance, she could touch him, and he went free. Not petitioned for, not negotiated, a single touch, and Rome's judgment was overridden. At the games, the Vestals had reserved seats above the senators, 6 women, chosen as children, sitting higher than the most powerful men in the empire. They also held custody of Rome's most sacred objects, kept in the inner sanctum of the Temple of Vesta, into which no man could enter. Among them, most scholars believe, was the Palladium, a sacred image of Pallas Athena that Rome claimed had been brought from Troy by Aeneas, the mythological founder of the Roman line. The Vestals did not simply tend a flame. They guarded what Rome believed its survival depended on. And then there is the other side of the institution. A Vestal found guilty of unchastity, of breaking her vow, was not executed in the ordinary sense. Rome could not be seen to directly kill a woman of sacred status, so she was taken to the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, on the edge of the city. A small underground chamber had been prepared. She was lowered into it with a lamp, a small amount of bread, water, milk, and oil, enough that Rome could say she had not been left to starve, merely confined, and the entrance was sealed. Her alleged lover was flogged to death in the Forum Boarium while the people watched. The case that cuts deepest is the execution of Cornelia, chief Vestal of Rome, ordered by the Emperor Domitian in 83 CE. He had her buried alive. her alleged lover was beaten to death in the Forum. Pliny, the Younger, who was a contemporary, recorded that Cornelia maintained her innocence throughout with complete composure, calling on Vesta and the gods to witness her purity as she was led to the Campus Sceleratus. Her bearing was not that of a guilty woman. It was that of a woman who knew she was being murdered for a different reason entirely. By 83 CE, Domitian was eliminating anyone whose authority existed outside his control. The chief Vestal's sacred power answered to no emperor. That was the problem. A charge of unchastity was uniquely useful. It framed a political killing as religious necessity and left the emperor's hands appearing clean. Domitian was assassinated 13 years later. The ancient sources noted the connection between his impiety and his fate without much subtlety. The logic that bound these two things together, the extraordinary authority and the entombment, is worth sitting with because it reveals exactly what the institution was doing. The Vestal's sacred power was understood to derive from her chastity. Her body, kept inviolate, was the vessel through which the fire's protection flowed to Rome. The fire and her body were the same kind of thing: sacred, maintained, never allowed to go out, never allowed to be touched. That logic gave her enormous power. It also made any transgression, real or alleged, an act not merely of personal failing, but of cosmic threat. And so, the punishment was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the mirror image of the authority. Both were total. What happened to a Vestal at 36, when her term ended and she was released back into the world? She had been chosen at 6 or 7. She had never kept a Roman household, never navigated the social world of a Roman matron, never managed the ordinary negotiations of adult life outside the sacred precinct. Rome did not simply open the door and wish her well. She received a substantial pension, a formal financial settlement that made her economically independent for life. She was permitted to marry if she chose, and some did. But the evidence suggests most did not. The Romans themselves noted this with some curiosity, and the reasons were not hard to understand. A woman who had held the authority of a Vestal, who had walked with a lictor, freed condemned men, sat above senators, was not easily absorbed into the subordinate role of a Roman wife. The social world of marriage required deference to a husband that many former Vestals appear to have found simply incompatible with who they had become. They remained respected. They kept their legal independence. They continued to be received in Rome's highest social circles, but they lived, for the most part, as women apart, defined by a role that had shaped every year of their adult lives and had no equivalent anywhere else in the Roman world. The institution ended on a specific date by a specific man's decision. In 349 CE, the Emperor Theodosius I ordered the extinction of the Vestal flame, the fire that had burned as the life of Rome for over 1,000 years, that had survived the sack of the city by the Gauls in 390 BCE, that had been carried to safety during the civil wars, that had burned through the rise and fall of the Republic and the birth of the Empire, was put out by imperial decree. The sacred objects kept in the inner sanctum were removed and dispersed. The Vestals were disbanded. 2 years earlier, in 392 CE, the same emperor had ended the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece. The same man, 2 years apart, extinguishing 2 of the ancient world's most enduring and most women-centered sacred traditions. When Theodosius extinguished the flame in 394 CE, the senator Quintus Aurelius Symmachus had already spent a decade fighting to prevent exactly this. 10 years earlier, he had written a formal petition to the imperial court, arguing that Rome's greatness had been built under the protection of the traditional gods, and that to abolish the ancient rites was to sever Rome from the source of its own survival. The Bishop of Milan, Ambrose, lobbied the emperor directly against him. Symmachus lost. The fire had survived the Gallic sack of 390 BCE, civil wars, and 1,000 years of crisis. Every Roman alive understood it as the life of their city, not as metaphor, but as fact. For the people of Rome, watching it extinguished by the order of a single man, in a generation when the borders were fracturing and the sackings were coming, would have felt like watching someone put a knife through the heart of the city deliberately. There was no vote, no council, no process by which Rome could say no. What replaced the flame was not a vacuum, but a deliberate new order, one that had found in monotheistic religion something the old tradition never offered: a theological system with no goddess at its center, no sacred feminine requiring honor, no Vestal whose authority derived from anywhere other than the emperor's will. The fire went out, the women were disbanded, and the world that replaced them had no category for what they had represented. That was not an accident. It was the point.